Hey, before we get started here, if you're not already a subscriber, click the button and ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks. One of the cool things about the channel is when I get to meet one of my virtual friends in real life. And so that happened during Muchapalooza during the summer when some of the patrons came to Annapolis and I got to meet them at long last in real life. And now one of the channel favorites is here in the States, our good friend Justin Bronk.
Hey.
Justin, it is so good to meet you in real life.
Mitch.
So you've been a fixture on the channel, maybe that's the wrong word, you've been a presence, episodic presence on the channel since the start of the war in Ukraine. In the comments over the months, people have asked, how is this guy so smart? Who is this enigma wrapped in a riddle that is Justin Bronk? So since we're face to face, let's take the time to tell a little bit of your backstories.
I'm a Londoner most of my life, went to university up in the north, in York.
When you say York, immediately I think of Braveheart.
Well, it's a sacked York.
If he can sack York, he can sack London.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to be a fighter pilot, straight up. I'm slightly colorblind, red-green, so I can't get a night rating. I knew that before I tried to join. I was hoping they wouldn't figure it out, but sadly they did. But so I tried that didn't work. I tried the BA Future Pilot Programs for British Airways. That didn't work out for the same reason. Then I did a master's. Then tried again for the RAF as an intelligence officer. Initially they said that'd probably be all right, but then eventually on medical appeal came back and said, no, actually, sorry, colorblindness is still the problem. You can be a loggie or a chaplain. And with no disrespect meant to loggies, I decided that probably wasn't for me. So civvy life, and then yeah, I kind of came across RUSI by mistake. A godfather suggested this place that I'd never heard of, and I was like, looked at it and thought, it looks awesome. Eventually swung an internship the second time around and kind of worked my way through that for been there 9 years as of last month. RUSI it's the Royal United Services Institute. It's a think tank, but it used to be part of the Ministry of Defence. It was founded by the Duke of Wellington after the Napoleonic Wars because it was supposed to be a place where rank doesn't matter, because his perception was the front line and kind of the junior officers in particular, but also some of the other ranks usually have not only really good ideas, but also know exactly what the problems are. He founded RUSI as a sort of military club where, as he put it, a junior officer can come and prod me in the chest and tell me what's going wrong in my army and what I need to be thinking about. The purpose that we're supposed to work to is pretty vaguely to enhance the quality of policymaking and debate on defence and security in the UK and its allies. Obviously with the Ukraine stuff, there's an extra angle of, there's a research for a public good point of view, there's also, to be quite honest, a wanting to help kind of angle to it, and also there's more of that translation sometimes required because the Ukrainian system is quite different from the Western military systems and political systems. So while there's a lot of common purpose, often the way that both sides go about things is quite different.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
There's room sometimes there's room to be helpful with that sort of interpretation.
So you're not a fighter pilot, but you are a pilot. And
Yep.
in fact, yesterday you had a cool opportunity to fly a heritage, let's call it a Warbird, with somebody the channel might know, Lucky Penny, who was the female aviator who launched her F-16 from Andrews on 9/11 with the tacit intent of potentially ramming one of the airplanes if she had to. So talk to us about that flight yesterday.
Lucky Penny is former F-16, I think, Air National Guard pilot, and has done various other cool things, but she's also a very, very keen aviator, lifelong aviator, and she mentioned that if the weather played ball on a Saturday, then would I be interested in a Stearman flight? So I said, yeah, absolutely. I don't have a huge amount of time in tail draggers, so nice to fly something different. And from an open cockpit standpoint, I mean, one thing that really struck me, it sounds obvious in retrospect, but you can smell things. Like you can smell a bonfire nearby, you can smell like
Really?
a bit of stuff coming off a factory.
Right? Yeah.
You feel a lot more connected to stuff, and because of the DC airspace, we had to be pretty low to stay under, I guess the TMA would be the British equivalent.
It's Class B airspace.
Yeah, exactly, Class B. And so you also just feel extremely close to everything. I must admit my rudder coordination took a little bit to get used to. It's got a very large, very effective rudder, and obviously being a biplane, quite light. Well, it's a reasonably heavy biplane, but lighter than I'm used to with a lot more lift. It's a bit more twitchy than I'm used to, but it was great fun. Really, really good fun. Very kind of Heather.
So let's get to the subject at hand. Again, it's brilliant that we get to do this in person. Your most recent essay at RUSI is basically a treatise. It's a 35, 36-page lengthy analysis of the air war to date. There is an executive summary at the beginning for those who are TLDR kind of people.
Yeah.
But again, I remind the audience that we've done some deep dives at various points since the original invasion, and this paper that you co-wrote with two others. Who were the two other guys?
So it's my colleagues Nick Reynolds and Jack Watling. So they work. They're the land team in the military sciences department, which is where I work at RUSI. So they were absolutely crucial for coordinating the trip, but also a lot of the introductions and the relationships required to conduct those interviews and to get in and out safely. They have a lot more experience in war zones than I do. So absolutely vital for me to have had their support in bringing that together. So yeah, definitely a team effort there.
So, and I'll paraphrase the title, it's the Russian air war and what Ukraine needs to defend itself.
Yep.
That's not the exact title, but that's kind of the scope of what this essay deals with. It's not an essay, it's sort of a white paper, I guess would be more accurate. So if you go back to our first episode that we did back in early March, this is where we were talking about the Russians' initial shortcomings. On paper, we thought they were going to do some things. You pointed out that they were short on precision-guided munitions, that they weren't training, that they'd learned some of the wrong lessons in Syria. And we had some sort of box scores of sortie counts on both sides. And this current paper sort of corrects the record against some of the information that you came into after that conversation we had. So let's talk about what we've learned since that original finding.
The key thing as a caveat to put up front is, the information in the report is based on a lot of interviews with multiple different bits of the Ukrainian Air Force, both on the GBAD side, the ground-based air defense side, as well as the aviation side, their intelligence guys, some of their logistics, their lessons learned, and their future capability development commanders. So essentially a lot of rungs of the senior leadership of the Ukrainian Air Force, as well as some of their intelligence agencies. But it is by definition kind of a relatively high-level picture of one side of the conflict. And so, as a caveat, I suggest it's more detailed and more accurate than a lot of what's come before, just because it is at least a view from inside as opposed to working with what crumbs we can see from the outside. But it's definitely not, I'm not suggesting it's kind of the final word on the conflict. But the kind of big headlines to me, as in terms of what was a surprise from looking into that, and we also inspected a lot of shot down or recovered Russian weapon systems, was first of all how much air-to-air combat there was in the first 3 days of the invasion. So the perception from outside, and I wrote a few articles at the time saying essentially, where's the Russian Air Force? What are they doing? And remember, speculating from the outside of saying, well, given how little warning the ground forces had, maybe they just weren't ready. They hadn't had time to spin up the sort of maintenance, the air tasking order as we would see it. But in fact, it's now fairly clear that the Russians flew several hundred sorties a day for the first 3 days, flying strike sorties up to 300 kilometers inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, so quite deep penetrations by day. Most of the strike sorties were at medium altitude with Sukhoi 34, some Sukhoi 30, and fighter patrols higher up, so 8,000 meters typically. Now, in one sense, the external analysis was on, in the sense that what they didn't do was kind of complex, mutually supporting strike packages. These hundreds of strike sorties were generally flown in singletons, occasionally, and about 25% in pairs or larger, and no formations observed more than 6. So, really quite small formations. And the fighter cover was more of a kind of roving CAPS, combat air patrols, rather than close escort for the most part. But this was all possible because the Ukrainian ground-based air defenses had been very, very effectively suppressed. So they had been very effectively jammed across a lot of their systems, been very good electronic warfare, planning and sequencing from the Russians, and they'd also received enough warning, thank goodness, to move everything that they could in the sort of final hours before the invasion. But what that meant was their units were repositioning. They were trying to get out of the W alignment to be able to reset their systems and start using them again, having to move them to avoid not just the missile strikes, but also those several hundred Russian strike sorties were overwhelmingly concentrating on air defense targets. So the air defenses were kind of suppressed and having to be continually moving and repositioning and trying to reset and repair things. So for those first couple of days, it was essentially the Ukrainian fighter pilots on their own trying to hold back the Russian air assault on Ukrainian airspace. And because of the extremely large range disparity between both the radar performance on the Russian fighters, particularly so the Sukhoi 30 and Sukhoi 35, and the Ukrainian MiG-29 and Sukhoi 27, so there's very, very big disparity in radar range and performance, as well as the Ukrainian ones don't have track well scan capabilities either, but also missile performance, so the Russians using R77-1, you'd say AA-12B, I think, and the Ukrainians stuck with R27, so not only much shorter ranged in a like-for-like launch setting, but also one's an active seeker, the other's semi-active, so the Russians can launch while in track well scan, so you don't necessarily get a launch warning. They can turn away once the missile goes active, whereas the Ukrainians not only have to paint them in an STT lock, which will tell them that they're being targeted, but they'll get a missile launch warning, and if at any point that lock is broken, the missile will miss.
So that's the key. They have to hold it to FPOL, right? And so there's no beaming, there's no, right? And so you're basically driving into a forward quarter Russian envelope by trying to prosecute your missile shot that's in the air.
Yeah.
So a huge disadvantage.
Well, and so what that essentially meant was that from the outset, the Ukrainians had to fly very, very low. So we're talking, 100 meters or lower, often really significantly lower than that. Exploiting the fact that they know the terrain very well, trying to mask, get underneath the radar picture of high altitude fighter patrols, because of course, once you get close, that search cone is actually quite limited in terms of altitude bracket. So if you can get in close, there's a chance. But also the Ukrainians are very outnumbered. So, by having to fly low and try and kind of creep up and ambush, in effect, higher flying Russian aircraft, they were able to claim some kills, but they also lost a lot of jets, a lot of pilots, and it also increased that range disparity because, of course, when you're very low, your own sensor picture is quite limited, but also your missile range is going to be that much shorter because your missile starts off slower in denser air and it has to climb against gravity to try and reach a higher flying, faster target. So even if they had parity in missile performance, which they didn't, having to fly low would have put them at a disadvantage to begin with. So, extremely impressive performance that they managed to kind of just about hold things back until the ground-based air defenses started to come back in, particularly on the third day onwards. But not something the Ukrainian Air Force feels they can do again. It's not reasonable to order fighter pilots to engage in confrontations with that level of technical imbalance. So, from their Air Force perspective, if they are to have a meaningful counter-air capability from the aviation side of things, they need Western fighters with radars, electronic warfare suites, and missiles that can at least approach effective range parity with higher flying Russian fighter patrols.
So you've just sort of laid out the air picture. Air power did not carry the day.
Nope.
It did stem the tide, but they didn't dominate. Ukrainian air power did not dominate. So you can kind of say that the GBAD picture is what really did diminish the effectiveness of Russian air. So talk to us about what they were able to do there and what kind of weaponry they were using.
So I mean, the interesting thing is that the GBAD picture on both sides was very limited in the first couple of days, and that's why you started with that very heavy air-to-air clash. So the Ukrainian Air Force was also very active, conducting bombing runs and rocket attacks on Russian columns in the first couple of days. Not that the Russian GBAD was suppressed by EW means, but they essentially were operating under very restrictive rules of engagement to assume that everything flying was Russian, because the Russian plan kind of assumed that every aspect was going to work. And so the strikes, long-range missile strikes, as well as the air strikes, would take care of the Ukrainian air defense picture and the Ukrainian Air Force, and therefore your GBAD wouldn't have to worry too much. So it's just a question of pushing forward. So their kind of SA-17s and SA-15s, as they were moving forward, had very, very limited rules of engagement and also no comms plan. So often moving forward without the encryption keys for their encrypted radios, not able to get on the net, as it were.
So they're broadcasting in the clear. And
Yeah,
we heard
if
some of
at
these
all,
comms
yeah.
early on in some of the video that was released.
Yeah, so that comms plan hadn't been done. And so that's why you saw in the first, particularly the first week, those kind of Bayraktar videos of them hovering over SA-17s and SA-15s, in some cases with the radar on. You're thinking, how on earth can they do that?
Yeah.
Well, it's because the Russians had orders not to fire. And so it took them a little while to work that out. And after the first 3 days, the Russian EW really started to be stepped down, partly because they were struggling to maintain alignment as the Ukrainian systems repositioned. So between those EW emitters and the sort of radars, but also because the Russian comms plan on the ground was going so dreadfully wrong, as the assault on Hostomel had failed, or their units were getting bogged down. Because they didn't have a comms plan, a lot of units, as you say, broadcasting in the clear, with often also radios that just didn't have decent jam resistance. Their own EW was becoming more of a threat to the ground campaign than the Ukrainian Air Force could ever be. So the Russian EW picture was scaled back very dramatically from the third day onwards. So as both sides GBAD kind of recover coming out of those first 3 days, you suddenly get to a position where you go from having a lot of air-to-air combat and a lot of air-to-ground strikes to very, very limited ability to penetrate on either side. And so the Russians basically launched a lot of anti-radiation missiles, KH-31P, KH-58 as well, the older one. Not very many hard kills, because again, ARMs are designed for suppression, not really hard kills. As long as the radar operator turns off and moves when they detect the launch, the missile will generally miss. Occasionally with pushing in Sukhoi 25 pairs or singletons to try and find and kill SAMs that were kind of moving or repositioning, but with no confirmed successes there and some losses to
So you use an
manpads.
interesting acronym with that mission. I guess we'd call it, if I call suppression SEAD, I know that some people are like, no, it's SEAD, but we always call it SEAD.
Yeah.
Then what you just described would be DEAD, right? I've never heard that. Yeah, destruction of enemy air defenses.
So if you read Dan Hampton's book, Viper Pilot, I think it's called, Viper Driver.
He talks about DEAD.
So he's a very experienced F-16 CJ guy, so wild weasel pilot who flew in both Iraq wars and I believe also in possibly in Bosnia. But he talks about extensively the difference between harm shooting for SEAD and the destruction of enemy air defenses role, which in his case was mostly with cluster bombs and in one case gun runs. So that requirement to actually go and kill the SAM that you've forced to turn off so that it's not a problem the next day.
Where did drones fit? Because we've already talked about the Bakhtar, am I pronouncing that right?
Bayraktar.
The Bayraktar drones. We saw the very dramatic videos up front of the tank columns getting, lead tank, trail tank, collapse the middle from those drones. And drones were kind of, got a lot of headlines in the early days. So how did they factor in? Because as you mentioned, intense air war first 3 days, and then it seems like the air war goes away. Now we're talking about, this ground war, the GBAD, and then it seems like drones factored in there. So how effective and who was using them in what way?
So both sides have been using drones extensively of all sorts, so from small UAS, little quadcopters and things, up to TB2, the Russian equivalents maybe be 4-post or Orlan-10, which is a bit smaller. The most lethal thing they've been using drones for, by far, is artillery spotting. So, for example, where the Russians have an Orlan-10 up, and this is still the case, they're quite light, about $75,000, $80,000 per UAV, so they're relatively cheap. And they have a range of payloads. They tend to have a complex of them with an EW payload to jam, for example, not just make SAMs less effective, but also to jam proximity fuses. They also have an ELINT payload to locate emitters that might pop up, or SIGINT payload to triangulate Ukrainian positions, and an optical one potentially with a designator to kind of call down artillery strikes within a couple of minutes, or increasingly now designate for Lancet 3 loitering munitions. So basically a propeller-powered missile that will come in and kind of follow the laser spot onto mobile targets. The Ukrainian internal position is fairly clear that after the Russian GBAD kind of got its act together, by the end of really the first week, the TB2s were of very, very limited use on the battlefield. It was a very important information weapon for them for a long time. So they stored up a lot of those those bits of really clear, compelling strike footage from TB2 from the first week or two, and they stored those up and kind of released them over a couple of months to make it look like...
So were they getting shot down at that point? Why were the drones? Because now the Russians are targeting them and shooting them down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So first of all, Russian EW is very capable, particularly against UAVs. It can't generally control the whole spectrum at once, because the Russians have a lot of different EW systems that generally do one bit of the spectrum each, and they don't necessarily play well together. Like, they interfere with each other, and they also cause fratricide. So, for example, the Kabini pods, the wingtip electronic warfare pods that are now pretty much theatre-entry standard for Russian flankers, they're very effective at jamming Ukrainian intra-flight communications and messing with their radars, but they also mess with the Russian radars in their own flight. So, if number 2 has his Kabini pods on, number 1 isn't going to get a decent radar picture, for example, because it will be messing around with it. So if you rely heavily on UAVs that use a particular part of the spectrum for communications or for reach back as a core part of your lethality, the Russians will tend to jam that quite quickly. But also, of course, TB2 is vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles, to manpads. Some Russian systems struggle in automatic mode because when it's flying very slowly and very low often. So it's not that you can't engage it, but you have to open the Doppler gates really wide. And so radars normally filter things out based on anything that's outside of a given speed range in order to avoid returns from trees and clouds and birds and the ground and all sorts of things. So if you're trying to find really slow things, like a Bayraktar going at kind of near stall speed into wind, for example, a system might well drop that unless you manually open the gates right up and look for it, which of course means you're then going to deal with a lot of random clutter. So it's not that they can't shoot down TB2s, and they did. In fact, TB2s have taken a lot of losses consistently and have really not been useful for a long time. In a direct support role. They're still useful for standoff BDA and spotting because they have very good optics, comparatively speaking. But for stand-in attacks on stuff, they're just way too vulnerable to SAMs. The drone side of things it's a very interesting facet of the war. But for those who kind of looked at those kind of TB2 or Lancet or Orlan sort of bits of strike footage and go, see, this is the future of air power, it's just not based on reality. The average kind of life expectancy of any UAV in Ukrainian service near the front lines is about 7 days. So, you need to treat them as munitions, not as aircraft. So you're buying them in those sort of quantities, you're not looking at a long-term support solution, and you're probably optimizing for a different price point than, for example, we have in counterinsurgency campaigns where a UAV is meant to last for years and conduct thousands of hours of operations. For the Ukrainians, one of the issues with their GBAD at the moment, which has successfully kept Russian air power, first of all, it forced them very low after the first 3 days because they couldn't suppress and destroy reliably the Ukrainian radar-guided SAMs, the SA-11 books, SA-8 OSAs, S-300s. They couldn't reliably destroy them or suppress them, even despite firing a lot of so ARMs from long range. So they tried going very low because the range of a radar-guided SAM without a sort of mast-mounted radar or something is quite limited against very low-flying targets because you've got the effect of clutter, terrain masking, the curvature of the Earth. So by flying very low, the Russians could avoid a lot of those SAM engagement envelopes. But, of course, then they're in the range of manpads. So man-portable air defense systems, things like Stinger, Igla, not effective against fast jets above about 10,000 feet. But if you want to come down into the low-level environment, then suddenly they're very effective indeed. And so both Russian aviation, in terms of attack aviation, so helicopters, and fixed-wing, tried low-level daylight penetrating operations for essentially the first week of March, lost a lot of aircraft, and also found it very difficult to accurately find and hit Ukrainian frontline positions. So they were kind of retasked after the first 3 days away from air defenses towards the Ukrainian army positions because the army was having trouble. And at low level, as I'm sure you know, you get a couple of seconds of viewpoint of the target if you know exactly where it is and you arrive exactly where you want.
That's the hard part, for sure.
And then you have to aim and you have to hit it with those couple of seconds of view, because if you come around again, they're going to be alerted and they're going to shoot you down. And also bear in mind, in this case, both sides using a lot of the same vehicles. They look very similar indeed, often dug in. It's muddy, it's cold, it's forested area for the most part up north. To be fair, Russian aviation was much more effective down south. So their strikes on Ukrainian GBAD were much more effective in the south.
Is that because the topography is more open, less forest? What is the...
So it's more open. It's also partly that some of the systems down there weren't mobile. Either things like SA3, modernized SA3 that just aren't mobile, or S300 batteries, PS or PT, that had real problems with serviceability on their trailers, and so actually couldn't be moved in time. But also because down south they get a lot less warning on launch, because a lot of those missiles are being launched from the Black Sea, so coming straight in across the coast. So for defences around Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, Kherson, they really got very little warning. And also just there were a lot fewer Ukrainian forces down there. So Russian, particularly attack aviation, helicopters, as well as fixed wing, were able to do a lot more damage after those initial missile strikes in the south than they were up north. And that's kind of a pattern in general. Like the Ukrainian force dispositions in the south were very, very limited to begin with, not just in terms of numbers, but also in terms of equipment. They were worried enough, and quite rightly so, about Kyiv and sort of secondarily Kharkiv up in the north, that most of the Western weapon supplies and a lot of the kind of rapid reaction forces were up there. And it was a very good strategy, but it did mean that, of course, the South has taken until now to liberate a lot of those gains. But having forced them low, the manpads kind of essentially made it prohibitive for them to operate across Ukrainian lines by day within about a week. And then they switched to night flying low to penetrate. But of course, at that point, a huge portion of their fleet was no longer usable because only a small portion of their fleet had crews who had a lot of experience and training to operate at night, particularly and contested at low level. So that was essentially just the Su-34 crews from the fixed wing, the Camel 52 crews from the helicopters, although in the initial month or two, they were also trying to use the Hinds and the Havocs, so the Mil-24 and 35s, as well as the Mil-28s at night. One interesting facet of why the Russian helicopters have struggled quite a bit at night, anywhere other than Donbass, where they know it quite well, is that Russian maps are very out of date. They're coming in with maps often decades out of date, paper maps. By April, you've got pretty much a cessation of penetrating flights by the VKS across Ukrainian lines. So going back to a lot of standoff attacks, ARMs, cruise missiles, KH-29, KH-59, as well as rocket lobbing, as we've seen from both the helicopters and the Su-25s. Has Russian air power been ineffective in the war so far? Yes. Does that mean it's not a threat? No. And in fact, the danger is, if you look at the rest of the Ukrainian armed forces, they've been transitioning quite successfully across to a lot of Western systems wherever possible, not just because they're in most cases superior to their Russian or Soviet era equivalents, but because we can support them. We can give them ammunition, we can give them spare parts. Not always enough, but that helps. In the GBAD side of things, actually, the West had very little to give. And so a lot of what Ukraine continues to hold the line with in the air defense domain is what they started with. There have been some deliveries in the last month of IRIS-T from the Germans as a medium-range surface-to-air missile system. Those are critical, but at this point, they're also just required really to hold the line on defending cities and infrastructure. There's not enough that we can supply, and certainly not that we have supplied, to kind of bolster and ultimately replace that job of holding the front lines and keeping Russian attack aviation and strike aviation at bay. So the danger is, if we don't find a way to sustainably resupply those SAMs with ammunition and over time find ways to replace them, because they are being steadily attrited, particularly by Orlan directed artillery and loitering munition strikes, then suddenly Russian air power really could become a major threat. The Russians are having real trouble pinpointing HIMARS. They haven't hit one yet. because it fires from far enough behind the lines, and the Russian strategic fire's targeting process is quite slow. But if you had Russian strike aircraft toting around, in the sort of 50 kilometers over your own front line at medium and high level, it would be pretty easy to spot those HIMARS launch trails by day or night, and you wouldn't need long in the threat envelope to come in and drop sticks of cluster bombs or rockets on them. So, again, just reinforcing that point of we need to keep them back on their side of the line, and Ukraine does need fairly urgent air defense material support to ensure that keeps happening.
Russian air power has not been great, but they have had some successes, and the paper mentions something that interested me, which is the MiG-31 Bravo Mike, which is basically kind of a Tomcat-esque in terms of track while scan, Phoenix ski in the form of the R-37 and the R-33. I'll remind the audience that we went in great detail using some footage of Russian airplanes taxiing, where we analyzed what was on the wing and what sort of type model series they were using for what mission. So if you haven't seen that episode, check it out. But let's talk about this long stick MiG-31 and how they're using that to good effect.
Yeah, so a lot of what Russian aviation is doing at the moment, because it can't yet penetrate sustainably again over Ukrainian lines, they're running a lot of fighter combat air patrols, CAPs. They've essentially divided the contact areas with Ukrainian forces into 8 sectors, and they run a pair on CAP in each one throughout at least daylight hours. And if you math that out, it comes to, if you assume a relatively generous 2-hour vol time, both Sukhoi 35 and MiG-31 have quite a decent internal fuel capacity, and at high altitude are quite efficient. They don't really have tanker support much, but they'd give you about a 2-hour vol time if you were efficient. That maths out to about 96 to 100 sorties a day. But they've got these high altitude fighter patrols that are operating high and fast enough and far enough back from the front lines that for the Ukrainians to threaten them with SAMs, they would have to put those SAMs unacceptably close to the front lines themselves and probably lose them. But because of this really long stick, the R37M, which they not only fire from the MiG-31, it's the core kind of weapon system for MiG-31BM, but they've also integrated it onto some of their Sukhoi 35s, so they are also operating with R37M now. It's a missile designed for 200 kilometer plus RMAX from really high and fast. But because
that's a gigantic number,
it's huge. I mean, it's essentially an updated version of the Phoenix concept, right?
I know, so but RMAX for us was like 80 miles.
Yeah, I mean, 80 miles is what? How many kilometers? It's about 150, 160 kilometers.
Okay, I was told
150 kilometers. Yeah, I mean, I'm not good at public math either. They particularly rejigged R37 not just for additional range. It's got an enhanced motor section. Took one apart in Ukraine, but it's got that extra reach. But also from MiG-31, you can easily be pushing significant supersonic Mach numbers at Block 55, 60 if they need, because that's kind of where it's happy. It's where it's designed to operate. And against Ukrainian ground attack aircraft at low level, their energy state is so low compared to the interceptor that you're also able to push the effective engagement ranges out. But they're not launching from anything like that far. It's just that the missile is kind of designed to have kinematics in that class. You can imagine kind of terminal defeat options to kind of trying to trash those shots for Ukrainian ground attack pilots. Very, very limited. And so it's a real problem for them in trying to project air power near the front lines, because these Russian fighter patrols are able to operate at a height and a speed and a distance that makes them pretty much invulnerable to retaliation, but can really act as a scourge against Ukrainian aircraft kind of for a significant distance near the front lines at low level. And Ukrainian aircraft can't fly higher because the long-range GBAD threat is still huge from the Russians. So yeah, it's a problem. But
is this like an asterisk on the air war, or is this turning the tide in some ways that are of concern?
It's the primary feature of what the Russians are doing right now in the air, these fighter patrols, and it's a real area of concern for the Ukrainian Air Force. But it's also a marker of what happens if the Ukrainian GBAD is allowed to be attrited away and run out of ammunition without Western support to refill and to ultimately replace. It's a marker of how, to such a great degree, the Ukrainian fighter force cannot hold them back on its own. And so, ultimately, if you take that as one of the pacing threats, it would affect your choice of what kind of Western kit would be needed to give you a fighting chance against that sort of thing. And I would split those into the choices that would make sense for the Ukrainians once there is a ceasefire of some sort to build up a sustainable air defense and deterrence capacity. And that answer is probably American, just because of the depth of American support, both financial and the amount of weaponry and aircraft potentially that are available. It's probably an American solution, and it's probably F-16.
What else would it be? Super Hornet?
I mean, Super Hornet, potentially, but again, the Navy seems pretty keen to hold on to the Super Hornets it has. Hornet would make sense from an operational point of view in the sense that it's designed for carrier ops, so it's got the undercarriage to deal with the quite rough runways that Ukraine currently has. But again, you're looking there at a difficulty in supply. The Marine Corps doesn't have a huge number of legacy Hornets left, and they're not in great state.
They're all high time.
F-16 is probably the answer because there's a lot of them. A lot of countries are currently giving them up to replace them with F-35. The problem is, well, a few. First of all, it's an American aircraft. It's designed for large, well-appointed bases with a lot of quite sophisticated ground support equipment that's quite large amounts of highly skilled ground crew and technicians, crew chiefs. And also, crucially, the F-16 is designed to be used on long, smooth, good quality runways. It's got a lightweight, quite flimsy undercarriage to keep the weight down, keep the thrust-to-weight ratio up. But of course, you know, if you ever watch an F-16 flare onto landing, it's gentle, and kind of kiss down and go along that long runway. The Ukrainians are operating from dispersed, quite rough, quite short in some cases, fields to avoid Russian missile strikes. And if you were to try and resurface a runway or extend it to kind of make it F-16 suitable, the Russians would see it from orbit and definitely from human intelligence as well and just put craters in it. So, and that's leaving aside hydrazine, which is its own interesting support requirement. So I think F-16 likely to be a core part of the Ukrainian Air Force post this phase of the war, if that makes sense, when they get it, when both sides are eventually exhausted or Ukraine has won, to kind of build out into a sustainable force. But for now, you need something that can operate dispersed. And that's really, from Western stables, only F-18, which has the issues we just discussed, or Gripen, which is the Swedish lightweight, medium weight, single engine fighter. They're kind of keen to help, but also it's not a country that's comfortable with arms supplies to politically contentious places, generally speaking. So, you know, there are significant political difficulties there. But from an operational point of view, Gripen is designed to operate from short, dispersed fields. It's designed to be incredibly easy to maintain. So the maintenance turnaround teams for the dispersed ops that they do are 6 people, only one of whom needs to be highly trained. The rest can be conscripts or even troops, just told what to do with standardized kit and hoists that do everything on the aircraft from 2 vehicles. So, you know, the whole maintenance pack for a Gripen wing lives in half-size shipping containers, even when it's on base. So it can just be put on the back of trucks and moved around at a minute's notice. Well, not a minute's notice, but short notice. Things like the APU, the auxiliary power unit, is high capacity enough to, if necessary, run all the self-bit tests and do a full cold start without ground power. So if you need to operate it in an austere location, as long as you don't need to do anything particularly unusual, you can do that. It doesn't require torque wrenches to get into any of the main service access panels. They're all just push toggles, which you can use with gloves in cold weather. You know, the aircraft's low to the ground, so even if you're quite short, or particularly quite short conscripts, or you know, Sweden has a lot of female conscripts, tend to be on average shorter, they can reach everything without needing ladders, which is particularly useful in really cold weather. It's got an internal electronic warfare suite that is specifically designed to degrade Russian fire control radars from fighters and a few long-range air defense systems, because that's Sweden's pacing threat. It's got a really, really clever modern avionics suite and a decent radar. It has an anti-ship capability, which is another Ukrainian requirement. It's also much easier and cheaper to maintain than an F-16 even, which is probably the most efficient American fighter to maintain. The question is whether it can be politically done. Retraining Ukrainian fighter pilots onto Western aircraft is probably a matter of a couple of 4 weeks to a few months, depending on what level of proficiency you want. The challenge is always going to be the ground crew, and bringing that kind of ecosystem to support the aircraft and keep those sorties going into service in Ukraine while under fire. Gripen would be easier than anything else, operationally speaking. Politically, maybe less so. But it's interesting to note that from the US side, there's really not a lot of positive mood music about supplying fighters. So, maybe looking at a European solution might be the best one. It's interesting people see a fighter as a very escalatory thing to send. I must admit I don't understand that, because we're supplying, as the West collectively at least, hundreds, thousands of HIMARS rounds, anti-tank guided missiles, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells explicitly to kill Russian soldiers by the thousands. And so a fighter which could be supplied with only air-to-air weaponry, and even if you went air-to-ground, unless you supplied them with cruise missiles, it's almost by definition a defensive weapon system.
Yeah.
Especially with the Russian GBAD laydown, which means that the idea that they could sustainably operate deep inside Russia or something, it's just not a thing.
Yeah.
So I must
deterrent.
admit,
it's not
right.
It's not
and the Russians in the air have actually been very cautious throughout, whether it's from GBAD or Ukrainian fighters in the first few days. A few losses seems to make them reassess tactics. There's not much evidence that there's a real killer instinct among their pilots. They're not particularly motivated to go and get shot down. And so, even a very small number of something like Gripen with Meteor, I think you probably only need a couple of engagements, 2 or 3 successful engagements, to have a really strong deterrent effect on the Russian Air Force across the board. So while it would be difficult to do at scale, particularly quickly, even a small amount could actually have a huge effect in terms of keeping that latent threat at bay. The difficulty with supplying more MiG-29, which is something that there are efforts ongoing to try and do.
Polish. That was the Polish option at one point.
Yeah, Polish, and there's a bunch of MiG-29 operators around the world. It would help bolster their ability to run counter-cruise missile and counter-Shahid loitering munition kind of defensive counter-air ops internally in Ukraine. Although munitions are still probably likely to be the key limiting factor there. But it doesn't help them with their Russian combat air overmatch problem, because it's still going to be a MiG-29, it's still going to have R-27 unless you could get a really recently produced one. And there aren't a huge number of nations where that exists and could even theoretically be supplied under some sort of deal. So politically really difficult, but I think definitely worth looking at, because the Ukrainians have suffered a huge number of casualties, both civilian and military, getting to the stage they're at now, where they've taken back almost all of Kherson, not quite all of it, but most of it. They've taken back the regional capital. They've taken back almost all of Kharkiv. They're kind of poised with the initiative, looking at next spring. The idea that because it's politically difficult, that we can't figure out something particularly over the sort of relatively lull winter months, a way to get them the air defense supplies that they need to kind of lock in all of those gains that have been so expensively won, just seems to me a bit of a cowardly thing to not push on where we can. It's difficult, but then most things are. And a world in which Ukraine gets rolled back because they can't keep their skies clear going into next year is one where almost all the outcomes are far worse than any complications we might see around the difficulties inherent in supplying.
And you guys point that out at the beginning of the article.
On the question of, why should the US in particular keep supplying Ukraine? It's interesting that it's becoming more of a partisan position, having not been up to now. Interesting discussions even with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs over the last few days. The thing, at least from an external perspective, would be the US is never going to find a more efficient use, from its own self-interest point of view, of defense spending than supplying Ukraine, in the sense that they're getting an almost, leaving aside the fact that it's the right thing to do to help defend a country that's been overtly and nakedly attacked with great brutality, and the fact that defending the rules-based international order, which the reason the Russians and the Chinese hate it so much is because it explicitly benefits America. Yes, it defends all of that, but leaving that aside, if you just strip it down to naked self-interest on why should we spend defense money on this or that, you're never going to get a more efficient opportunity to write down one of your two major peer competitors, at least in the nuclear space for the Russians, and a huge spoiler for any ability to focus on the Chinese going forward. If the Russians don't lose, then actually America still has to keep forces in major form in Europe. America still has to worry about that threat there that it's treaty bound to defend. And so for the cost of sending continued support to Ukraine, both in terms of money but also munition stocks, I would just say you're never going to get a more efficient way to write down for the next 5 to 10 years one of your key strategic adversaries without a single American life being threatened. I've never seen a more efficient use of tax dollars. And certainly in the UK, we have huge financial difficulties in the UK at the moment. That despite those difficulties and despite it being a very polarized time politically speaking, support for Ukraine, military support for Ukraine, keeping going is a completely bipartisan issue. It's just not a political debate because it's so obviously a win. From an outside perspective, America's played Ukraine incredibly well from a domestic kind of cost-benefit point of view. So I would kind of make a plea from a concerned ally going, please don't waver. You've been doing it brilliantly up to now. Keep it up.
As always, you've cut through the clutter with this great information. Thanks for spending some time with us during your time here in the States. It's great to finally see you in the flesh.
Likewise.
Safe trip home, and we'll look forward to having you on the channel again very soon.
Thanks.